Welcome back to the Application Lifecycle Development course. In this lesson, we're going to set up our continuous deployment for our development stack. Now, there's 3 of these lessons, one for development, one for staging, and one for production. And you'd think that it would be kind of the same for all 3, but really this is the one that's going to take the most configuration, the most work, just because of the fact that we're kind of inventing it from scratch. And the other 2 environments really should be almost mirror images. So if we do it in one, we should probably do it in all 3 so that we have that same experience. Remember I said that if you get to production, that should be the 3rd deployment the same exact way. If you go through dev and then staging and then deployment, that way you know the process works and you don't have to worry about the process being correct or you missing a step somewhere. So these 3 lessons aren't really even as far as the amount of work we have to do. This is the one that's going to be the one where you pay the most attention and make sure you get the different pieces of it. And we'll do it again for staging and again for production. And I'll talk through the differences when we get to those lessons. But for now, let's start on how we're going to deploy this application. So we have our Azure site and we have our development web app. We have our development database and we have our development user database, our auth database and user database. So let's start off with the basics. So let's go to our pipeline and go to release. And we have no release. We're going to create a new one. And this one's going to be the dev release. So again, just like with our build, it has a template. This is kind of nice because Azure App Service Deployment is right there. So deploying a web app on Windows, Linux, Container, Function App, or on web jobs. So that's already set up, but there's other options here again as well, where you can deploy to Go or Azure Service Fabric or even IIS. And so that's one of the questions that comes up with this course quite a bit is, well, I want to deploy to IIS, which I'm sorry you have to deal with that because IIS is a little more work on your part because you have to set up the sites and you have to do all the configuration. But in this deployment process, no problem, right there. Deploy an ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core web application to an IIS on a physical or virtual machine. So that'll make your life easier. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to go up here to Azure website and just looking at the web apps. We don't want a slot. We're going to cover that in a future lesson. But for now, slots are just the ability, again, to swap from one to the other so that it's a much quicker deployment process. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to go up here to Azure App Service Deployment and hit apply. We could have started an empty job. So the first thing it'll do is it'll ask us to name the stage. We're going to call this stage development. So this is the development stage. And the reason why we have stages here is because we could have multiple stages right in a row. We're not going to. We're going to create pretty simple release pipelines. And the reason why is because we don't have this complicated environment. But what you can do, and what I do for my company, is we have a pre-production stage that leads right into the production stage. So in pre-production, we deploy it like normal. And then once it's deployed, it goes to the next stage and waits. And it requires an approval. And once we get the approval, then it just swaps those slots to take pre-production into production. That's something you can do. You can have multiple stages in here with multiple things. But for us, we're going to keep it really simple and do one stage. So let's talk about what this is. First, we have the artifacts. Remember that we called the drop. That's an artifact from our build process. We're going to add that artifact. So we first get the data or the files. Then we do something with them. In this case, we're going to deploy them to Azure Web Apps and also to SQL. So we're going to add an artifact first. It's from a build. And we're going to say that it is the lifecycle project build. Okay, so there's the artifact type. Default version is at the time of release creation. That's fine. And the alias is the lifecycle build or project build. Okay, so let's just go ahead and grab the build that just happened, but we're not going to grab every build. So we're going to come up here to this continuous deployment trigger and say we want this to happen automatically. So continuous deployment trigger is enabled, and we're going to add a branch filter. So we'll say include just the master branch. Now you could say certain tags. So if you want to, you can include the master branch, but say only when there's a tag that says deploy or something like that. But for us, we're going to say that this will only be enabled for the master branch. That's our development branch. That's pretty standard. Now we're not going to say any tags because it's going to be any tag. It's going to be anything, just anything off the master branch. And this is continuous deployment. So again, just like the build where it gets triggered off of with continuous integration, it gets triggered off of the commit. With this, the continuous deployment gets triggered off of a completion of the build of a master branch commit. Okay, we're not going to do a pull request build. So what this is for is if you do a pull request, then it's going to build that pull request, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to build based upon the master branch. Okay, so we set up the artifacts. We said grab the artifact from this this build, and we've done that, and only trigger it off of the master branch. So when that happens, we're going to come over here to development or deployment. I'm sorry, we're going to come over here to development, and we're going to say that you want to do these jobs. Now see this link right down here. If you click on the blue box, it opens up this stage name. What we want is the jobs. So click on the one job, one task. And we need to give it the Azure subscription. That's my Visual Studio Enterprise. Click authorize. And it's going to authorize that, and it should just authorize if it's wired up correctly. There we go. So now it's authorized. I'm going to say web app, and the web app name is going to be the LP development. So that's the name of the deploying to Azure web app, Azure App Service. So that was really all we did to configure this one job we have. That's what we're doing right down here. We're deploying to a web app, and we're saying here's the web app, here's the name. We're not going to deploy to a slot. That's, again, I'm going to cover that in a later lesson. We're not going to worry about these other pieces here, the transforms. We'll get to that in a minute. But for right now, again, we have the control option down here to enable or disable it, and a continue on error. So that's all there really was to configuring this task of deploying the app service. But we're not really done yet. There's a couple things we have to do before we're done this process. So now that we have this done, let's go ahead and add our job for SQL as well. So let's hit plus here. And we're going to look for, let's type SQL here. We have two jobs that are in Azure itself or Azure DevOps. And then we have more in the marketplace. There's a lot more in the marketplace you can go and look for. And there's a bunch of different options here, including SSRS and SSIS deployments. But for us, we just need the Azure SQL database deployment. Not MySQL, SQL. That's the black icon. So we're going to deploy a Azure SQL DB using DACPack or running scripts using SQL command. So we hit add. And right away it says we need some things set up. So first of all, we'll set up our subscription. And why it has two, I'm not quite sure. I think one of them has already been authorized, but they both say, one says service connections and one says subscriptions. Let's do service connections. It's already set up. So that's basically one is the ones you've already authorized, and one is the list of all of our available subscriptions. So our Azure SQL name is going to be, and that's our full name, so it should be including database.windows.net. So let's go ahead and grab that, our full name of our database for users. And there's our server name. I'm going to copy that. They place little buttons next to it, which to click to copy. That's very easy. Awesome. We can paste that in. Our database name is Lifecycle Project, but that should just be actually LP Dev User DB. So that's a database name. This is a server name. This is the database name. And the server login. This is going to be something where I don't want to just type out my, if I were to type something here, you could see it. And that's not great. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to set up a variable. I'm going to call this my SQL username. And we'll call this the SQL password. These are variables. And so what I'll do is I'll go over my variables tab. I'm going to add a variable. So SQL username. And I'll put a value in there. And then I'll add one more for SQL password. Now I'm not going to do this on screen. I'm going to pause the video for a minute. But then I'll hit the lock key when I'm done. And it's going to hide those. So let's go ahead and pause the video. All right, so I'm done that. And now as you can see, the lock icon is here. If I were to unlock this, it actually wipe the value out instead of showing it to me. And that's a security feature. So once it goes in and gets locked, it does not come out. Now, the scope here, it says release or development. And this applies to my my pipeline right here. Notice it says this stage is development. So if I said development, those variables would only live inside here. So if I had another step, like my pre-production and then production over here example, I could have different variables here in this versus over here in the next stage. But in this case, I'll leave it at release because of the fact that it can be used across the entire pipeline. This one pipeline, but the entire one. Okay, so now back here, I have my SQL username and SQL password. Let's just verify that yes, in fact, SQL username and SQL password. Excellent. And my action here is I want to publish my SQL script from a DAC pack. I need to find that file. However, in my build, I'm not bringing it over, I don't believe. No, I'm not. I'm bringing the zip file over, but that's not really helpful for this. It's helpful for Azure, but not for this, I need to copy some files to this artifact staging directory. So let's add a new task. Let's search for copy. So copy files. And copy files, let's call it for SQL. And the source folder, we can go in here to our user database. Inside here, the problem is we don't have our bin folder here, which is the compiled version of this particular the project. So we have a couple options here, and let's go back and look at our build solution, and let's look at these build arguments for a minute. All right, let's see if I can get this on the screen. There we go. So we have our build on deploy equals true. Great. Deploy on build is true, which I'm not sure you want that. Then we also have web publish method is package, and package is a single file is true. So these flags right here are going to put everything in that zip file we saw. The problem is we need inside that zip file in order to get certain files out, mainly that backpack file. So what we're going to do, we have a couple different options. One, we can break open that backpack file, that zip file, and get the file we need. Or two, we can change this configuration to not do this. All right, so let's do this. I am going to copy all of this out, and we're going to try something else. And there's a bunch of different options you can do when it comes to, here, let's zoom back out. A bunch of different options you can do for build arguments, and you can go to the help here and get all the different options. I'm going to come over here and I'll just off screen paste it into a notepad. I'm going to try something else instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out a little script and paste it in. So just going to grab this and paste it in, and all it's going to do for an argument is say we want an output directory of our build artifact staging directory /_ published websites _ the lifecycle project. Let's try that and see how it works. Again, you can go here, get more information, and look through all your different options for what to do. And there's a whole bunch of different suggestions there and all the rest, and links to even more spots. But for now, let's try this. And we'll come out here and we're going to look. We have to delete this because that's actually causing a problem right now. Let's go ahead and get rid of, remove right here. Get rid of that. And now we can actually save and queue this. Remember, it's going to not trigger a release yet, but what it will do is it will create those files for us. We can see how it's going to look. So save and queue. Again, I'll give it a name. So updated how build works, and leave the rest the same and save and queue. And once that's done, then we'll have updated files to work with for our copy. So I'm going to pause the video and wait until this is done, and then I'll come back. So let's go over to the build itself, and then I'll come back in just a minute. All right, so now that our build is done, we can go to our build itself and just look at the files that it created. So go to artifact, go to drop, and look, now it's got inside drop, it's got this published websites, which we could probably eliminate if we need to. And inside there we have our project itself. And inside here we have another published website where we have all of our files. This is what we're actually going to publish to our Azure website, is this folder right here. But then we also have all of these files, and down here near the bottom should be user database.dacpack. Sorry, dacpack, not backpack. So I get these confused all the time. So DAC or BAC. There's a difference. One takes data, one does not. The DACpack is just the definitions, whereas the backpack includes data, which that's why it's confusing for me, because the DACpack starts with a D and you think that means data, but it doesn't. It means definitions, I think. And so one way to remember it is backpacks hold stuff. And so that's what holds the data. So in this case, just a DACpack, which means just a definition for our database. So that's what we're going to need. Now we have that, we can go over to our release step and make some configurations to our release pipeline. So go over here and edit. And we need to make some changes to our jobs. First of all, on our Azure deploy, right now we're saying deploy a zip. That's not what we want. We actually want to grab in here in the drop. We want to grab this, everything inside here. So this whole folder. So this, and we should say, actually I think that's it. So I think that's all we need to say is the folder name. It's going to take that folder and deploy it. We'll make sure when it comes time. But for now, we can go down here to the SQL publish. And remember, this is the wrong path. So let's go ahead and fix that. So inside the drop, we come down to this location down here and grab the DACPack file. And that's what we want to publish. Now you may ask, well, what about the entity framework database? And that's a little bit different. Because entity framework code first, what it's going to do is the first time you run it, it's going to look at the web config file and say, okay, that's where I live. Therefore, I'm going to make sure the database is there. And if it's not, I'm going to create it. But the problem is that let's save this, our web config file has the path for our local machine. That's the connection string it has in there. We need to change that. And the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to use these variables to put our connection strings. So we're going to have a connection string for our entity. The connection string for that connection. But instead of pasting one in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in one of those variables from my release pipeline. And the way you do that is you do pound and then, or the hashtag, and then open and close curly braces, another hashtag. Inside here, inside the curly braces, with no spaces, put the name of your variable. So let's call this the auth_db connection string. That way it's very clear what it is. And it's going to transform that connection string based upon matching the name. So it's going to look for the attributes to transform, in this case the connection string, which is right now set to our local DB. And instead it's going to transform it to this value, which right now is just a variable reference. However, in the release pipeline, we'll go ahead and change those variables over to be real values. So we're going to do one more, and that's going to be for the user DB. So I'll copy this and I'll paste it down below, just the add statement, not the connection string wrapper, because this defines the whole section. And you can read more about it here if you'd like. You go ahead and eliminate this comment though. So this one is going to be called user database. So user database, and instead of auth DB, it's going to be user DB connection string. So those are the two transforms we're going to do. Now, before I commit this code, I'm going to make sure that I set up my build server to do this release transform. So let's go over to our build pipeline. And let's stay here for a minute. I want to make sure I don't lose any changes that I have. I've got the changes I published. Let's go ahead and hit save and updated SQL publish and call it good. I'm not going to queue it. I'm going to create a new build off of this. Just going to save it, go back to my builds and edit my build. And this is something you'll find you'll do quite a bit. Even though I know a lot about DevOps and I've used it quite extensively for well over a year, it's still something where, depending on your environment and how you set things up, things have to be tweaked a little bit. And that's okay. Don't feel like if it doesn't go exactly to plan, there's a problem. Just keep working the problem, keep working at it until you get where you need to be. So what I'm going to do is, after my NuGet restore, I'm going to add a config transform. So let's look for config transformation, which is actually in the marketplace. So I'm going to install that, get it free. I'm going to say get it free. Actually then go and put those variables in our release pipeline. So let's save this. Let's just save it for now. We're not going to queue it yet. And we'll say that we added config transform. I'm not going to queue it yet. We want to make sure this process works. So let's go down here to release. Going to hit edit on our only pipeline we have. And in the variables, we need to add two new variables. And let's just pull that up real quick so we have a list of what they are. It's auth DB connection string and then user DB connection string. So we need to add auth DB connection string and user DB connection string. There we go. But now we also need to get those connection strings. So we come over here to our user DB, show database connection strings. Click on it, and we copy it. Now you may go, oh my goodness, team, you're showing your password. Nope, I'm not. It says your username and your password. So that's not a problem because I don't have to worry about actually pasting these in. Now, the only problem is I have to actually put those values somewhere. So I'm going to paste this into Notepad, and I'm actually going to add the usernames and passwords for this particular database, or actually for both of them. And I'll paste them in and then lock it. So I'm going to pause the video for just a minute to paste them in, and I'll hit the lock so you can't see the result. So now those two connection strings are in and they're locked. So now that when we go through the transformation process, we're going to make sure that we transform these two variables. Now you might wonder, well, how do you do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's go to our tasks. And in here, we need to add a new task. What we need to do is look for the replace tokens. And it's actually another marketplace add-in. This is really helpful. So what it's going to do is replace the tokens in files. So we get it for free. We're going to say get for free. Wait for it. We're going to install it. And now we're all set. And it should be if we hit refresh here. There we go, replace tokens. I'm not quite sure why the icon changes from one to the other. It's a little weird, just the background color changes. But I hit there, I'm gonna move this up the process. Before we deploy, we're gonna replace the tokens. And the cool thing here is we don't need to do anything. So it's just set up for us. It's going to replace the tokens in any .config file in our entire solution. So it's going to look for .config anywhere and replace the tokens. So what this does is it goes out and it looks at your variable list and then goes and finds any variables in the list somewhere that have that particular set of sequence where it has the hashtag and then the curly braces, and that's what it's showing in this picture, and it replaces that with the value. So those connection strings are going to get put in place where they're currently just that tag. So now we're going to transform the tokens. We're going to deploy to Azure, and we're going to publish our SQL for the user database. And that should be all we need to do for the development deployment. Let's save this, add variable or token replacement, and we're hit OK. Now we'll come back to the pipeline. Let's turn continuous integration back on for the master branch. Unfortunately, it wipes that out when we turn it off. And we'll hit save. Continuous deployment back on. Continuous deployment is when you send it out to a server. Continuous integration is when you build it and run the tests. So now with that being done, anytime we kick off a build here, it's going to, once it's done, kick off the release process. Now, just to kind of make sure we are on the same page here, let's go to our dashboard and open up our web app again and leave it open. That's right now, that's where it's at. There's nothing here. The next thing I want to show you is the databases themselves. So let's go ahead and open up SQL Server. I've already pasted in my credentials. I'm going to hit connect to lifecycleproject.database.windows.net at port 1433. And what it's saying is, guess what? I'm not signed into Azure, so I can't do that. And the reason why is because of a firewall issue. Remember I said that with Azure, it does not allow us to connect to anything. And we had to open up that port for even just Azure. But if you come up here in your Azure SQL database. Let's go to our actually to our server itself. So let's go to all resources and look for our server. There it is, lifecycle project. And in here, what we can do is we can look for the firewall rule. And that's down here at the bottom, firewall and virtual networks. And inside there, we can say, right now that's already checked. We checked that when we built or we created this thing. We want to add our client IP address. And that's actually my client IP address right there. I could create the rule for it, but if I just say add client IP, it does it for me. All I have to do is hit save. So yes, if you can spoof my IP address, you can actually connect to my Azure if you also have my credentials. Pretty hard to do, but technically probably possible. Okay, let's try this again. Now that box that just popped up, it did say I could log into Azure and then it would create the firewall rule for me, which is kind of nice, but I wanted to show you how to do it manually. So hit connect, and now we can connect. And if we open this up, we can see that we have 6 databases. Let's look at our user dev database, and it has no tables in it. Let's make sure. Wait for it to expand. It takes a little bit sometimes when you first connect and you're first spooling up a database, especially for these cheap databases. But there's no tables there. Same thing, let's check the auth.db to make sure it has no tables as well. Again, just to verify that we're starting from scratch. There's nothing, kind of primed or ready for this. It's all just, bare bones what we created in a couple lessons ago when we created these Azure SQL databases. Now let's go back to our website and go back to our pipelines, and let's go ahead and kick off another build. But this time, let's first of all go over here and watch the builds. This time I want to go to the source code to do this. And the reason why is because I just want to kind of show this whole process working from start to finish. And we do have these changes to our config file to do. So I can come over to our Team Explorer and go to our changes. We have one change that will stage and say add config transforms for connection strings as variables to be replaced during deployment for the 2 connection strings. We're going to commit that stage, and now we're going to go to sync. We'll do a fetch first to make sure there's nothing on the server we have to pull down, and there actually is, because we created that README where we made a change. So now we can't push until you first pull. Now the sync button kind of does that job for you. It does a pull and then immediately does a push, and if nothing is wrong, you kind of don't even see it. But I want you to do this in 2 steps because of the fact that you actually see what's happening, and if something does break, you know the process for it. So if you're in the command prompt, it'd be git pull. And click the pull button, and it's going to pull, and it's going to create a merge commit. And what that merge commit is just saying, okay, there was changes that you had to bring into yours, and you didn't have them in your commit, so I'm going to bring those changes in a merge commit. So now that that's done, we actually have 2 commits to push. So I hit push, and it's going to push those changes up to the server. Once that's done, what we'll see is we'll see a new build kick off, and that's right there. So it's kicked off. That blue with a circle icon indicates that it's currently running. And do notice I mentioned in the previous lesson that I thought it was the waiting indicator. And the reason why is because let's look at the waiting indicator. That's the waiting indicator. That's the currently running indicator. So they're pretty close. They're the same blue. It's just one's got those 3 little white lines in there that indicate a circle, and one's got the more clock face of it where it indicates that it's waiting. So that's how you can tell the difference. Go ahead and pause this. There's no reason to watch it go through the whole process. Now it's just finishing up, but we do have a couple of warnings here. We're actually missing those test assemblies. It says no test assemblies found. So we're gonna have to go ahead and change that soon to fix that. But for now, the build did succeed. Let's go to release and notice the release is already kicked off. So let's click on release 1 to actually see what's going on. And they're making big improvements. Great. So we can read that later. But for now, we see that it's grabbed automatically the build process or the build result from the master build or master branch build. And now it's in progress for deploying it to Azure. It's replaced the tokens already. Now it's deploying it to Azure. Next, we'll get into publishing to SQL. And we'll see how this goes. And so there we go. We can see that it's actually pushing those files up. We can see the files that are going and where they're going to. So that's kind of helpful. It shows us we have 176 files that went up. Now we're getting into the SQL publish. And we can look at that in just a minute once it's done. And that should be pretty quick. It's just going to grab that DAC file and publish it. Now we do have an error here. So it errored out on Azure SQL Publish, and it's got 3 errors. But check this out. It's really helpful, the reason why it errored. It shows you why. So it says an error occurred. Deployment cannot continue. So it stopped right here, and the deployment is marked as a failure, which is awesome to see a failed deployment. But it says the project which specifies SQL Server 2016 as a target platform cannot be published to Microsoft Azure SQL Database version 12. The DAC pack failed, and it exited with code 1. So we have to change our SQL project, but it kind of tells us what to do. Change it from targeting SQL Server 2016 to targeting Azure SQL Database. So that failed, but in theory, we did publish to Azure. Let's see what's going on here. So let's refresh the page that was just that blank page and see if it changes at all. Again, these publish profiles, it's hard to get right the first time, and that's okay. Because you just keep working at it until you get it right, and then once it's right, then you just document the process, and you have it, and it just runs. So the first time you start up a website, it's going to be slow because of the fact that it's got to kind of spin up and spool up. But there we go. We actually have our website set up and running. If we come over to our SQL Server, our tables for AuthDB, nothing yet. Our tables for UserDB shouldn't be anything, but let's just make sure, and that's correct. But let's go to register, and I'll create a new user for this. So again, a little slow at first. It'll get faster, but again, we also on the cheapest platform we can run. So there's gonna be a little lag, there's gonna be a little bit of a speed issue as it kind of at least starts up, but also as it runs somewhat. Not quite this long. This is just first startup kind of wait times, and it may even be creating that database as we go. All right, so let's register. So I'm going to register my email address and my password, my super secret password. I hit register. And that should create the database for us. It should create my account, and it should log me in. Run our tests for us as well. So we got a couple things to look at. We're going to go ahead and address that in just a minute. And actually, let's do it right now. Let's start with our build process and look at why we're not running tests. So I think the issue here is that we're running in this working directory, default working directory for our search folder, and we're limiting it to build configuration over here. Let's change this over to be our artifact staging directory. So we actually have that right here, the artifact staging directory. So let's change this right there. And then also I am going to say, you know what? I want you to run everything that says test. So as long as it says test.dll, the only thing I don't want you to run test on, that's the exclamation point is for, I'm going to say if it is star.test.adapter.dll. So that'll limit and say run anything that says test in the name and it's a DLL, but don't run the test.adapter.dll because that would be where the XUnit test adapter is. We're going to run it in that artifact staging directory. So anything in there, let's go ahead and process it as a test. So we've got a couple options here. We can save and queue, or we can just save. I'm going to just save fix test adapter, or hopefully fix the test adapter location lookup. And now what we need to do is we need to fix our code. So let's look at that error one more time, the release error, which big bad error. Hate having the red there, but that's okay. And we can look at why it failed, and it tells us right here. Now this is one of those things where what I would do and what he actually did is I just copy this and paste it into Google and see what we get. And I actually added VSTS. And they come up with this article right here, which is really helpful. So I'll try and remember to add a link to this, but this article right here, if you scroll down, it says, okay, he did a little research for why there's an error and saw us targeting the wrong thing. But here's the problem. We are targeting SQL Server 2016. We deploy it locally. But don't worry, there's a build process step that you can do. So here in his build process, he added this argument right here to change it to the Azure V12 schema provider. So I'm just going to copy this, which thank you for that. And I'm going to come over here to my build process, and I'm going to edit it and come down here to my build process here. And I'm going to add a space and then paste that in to hopefully transform to our Azure V12. At this point, I am going to save and queue since this should fix everything in theory. Let's find out. So save and queue, fixed SSDT or SQL Server Data Tools targeting. And we're going to hosted VS 2017 and master. Save and queue. I can click on that link to go right to it. And now we're waiting for it to start. We'll watch it go through the process. I'll go ahead and pause the video though. I'll watch it. I'll let you know when we get to the right point. And it failed the build. So let's find out why. And this can get quite dense. But if we look, I think it should be down here near the bottom. And we should look down here where it says the build failed. It says there's 0 warning, 0 errors, which is interesting that it says 0 warning, 0 errors, and yet it failed. But I think up here somewhere, the user database, prepared for build, compiled, done, default target, it failed. So it failed in the process. We're not quite sure why. But let's go back and look at that article again. I think that one of the things that's always helpful I should have done is let's show responses. And but our test assemblies worked. Notice down here that we have a running test, one total test. That's correct. That's what we wanted to see. And we also have a build that's working. Now, we do have a symbol path problem. No files were found. On our symbol paths, we got to change that. But that's not a huge deal since we're not using symbols yet. Let's go to our release. And that is just kicked off. We'll see if this time the release works. In the meantime, let's look at what we have in our build for our tests. And we have one test. It took a little longer last time, sure, because last time we had 0 passing tests because we had 0 tests. So again, these first numbers are not really indicative of overall performance. But once we have this in place, we should be good to go. And now we can watch our release process and hopefully we should see, 6 out of 6 tasks are in progress. We're just doing our SQL publish now. We have published to the app service. Let's watch the Azure SQL publish and make sure that it works. All right, here we go. And it's completing. So if we look back at the actual publish, since it went so fast, it created the dbo.person and then it updated the database. And now we are done. So let's go back to SQL, make sure in fact we are done. Let's refresh this. And yes, we have one person or one table called dbo.person. And in it, we have 3 entries, Tim Corey, Sue Storm, and Bob Smith. So now our SQL database is also correctly published to the cloud. We still have our home page here. So that's still up and running, and we still have our authentication database. So everything is good. Nothing has broken. And now our entire dev system, 2 databases and a website are all up and running. Next we need to do is we need to clean up the build process a little bit, make sure we get that PDB file either correctly publishing or just ignore it. We can probably ignore it. And then what we'll do is we can move on to the next phase, which is the staging environment.